January 1945. A bitter wind cut across the snow-dusted fields of an Allied POW camp in central Germany. The skeletal trees rattled their branches like dry bones against the gray sky. Inside the wooden barracks, the scent of wet wool and smoke lingered in the air. Rows of women, uniformed in faded Axis garb, sat stiffly on narrow bunks. Eyes wary, hands clenched around whatever small possessions had survived the journey from their homeland. A group of American officers entered, carrying crates, books, newspapers, photographs of Hollywood stars, women in flight suits, smiling faces caught in frozen moments of leisure and life far removed from the front lines. The women watched in disbelief. Some whispered to each other, unable to reconcile the ease of these objects with the strict discipline they had known. For these prisoners, German and Japanese alike, this was a world they had been taught could not exist. A world where laughter, curiosity, and knowledge were allowed, even encouraged. Their eyes widened, and a quiet murmur spread. Nothing in their training had prepared them for this. And in that moment, the first barrier between captor and prisoner began to shift. By 1944, the tide of World War II had firmly turned against the Axis powers. Germany faced a relentless advance from the Western Allies after the D-Day landings in Normandy, while the Soviet Red Army pressed from the east. In the Pacific, Japan was steadily losing territory to the advancing United States and Allied forces. Both nations, once confident in their ideological and military supremacy, were now confronting the stark reality of defeat. Amid this chaos, thousands of Axis soldiers and officers were captured, including women who had served in support roles, communications, nursing, and even administrative and propaganda positions. Female prisoners of war were not a common sight in previous conflicts, but the total mobilization of Axis states meant women were increasingly present near military operations. The German Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe had trained women in auxiliary roles, and the Japanese military had incorporated women in clerical, nursing, and support capacities. While these women were generally far from frontline combat, they were indoctrinated with strict notions of duty, loyalty, and subordination to male authority, reinforced by propaganda that framed the Allied powers as morally corrupt and culturally inferior. The Allies, particularly the United States, had prepared for the humane treatment of prisoners of war, adhering to the Geneva Convention of 1929. POW camps were organized with strict but fair routines, roll calls, meals, work assignments, and occasional recreation. Officers oversaw the camps with discipline, yet there was a conscious effort to maintain moral standards, prevent abuse, and even provide educational and recreational materials. Unlike their Axis counterparts, American and British officers believed in the value of engaging prisoners intellectually, morally, and psychologically, a stark contrast to the rigid, often punitive structure of Japanese and German military indoctrination. In Europe, camps such as the U.S.-run facilities in Luxembourg, Belgium, and France began to hold female German prisoners. These women were generally officers, administrative staff, or auxiliaries, often young and trained in a system that emphasized obedience above all. They had been raised in societies where women's roles were narrowly defined. Leaders, educators, or combatants were rare exceptions. Many had received extensive propaganda education, portraying Allied women as frivolous, morally loose, or weak. They had also been instructed to view Allied soldiers as merciless and untrustworthy, a narrative designed to discourage surrender and reinforce loyalty to the Reich. Across the Pacific, captured Japanese women faced a similar cultural dissonance. In Japan, women had been trained in strict social hierarchies and expected to uphold the honor of family and nation, even in captivity. When captured by American forces on islands such as Iwo Jima, Saipan, or the Philippines, they encountered a radically different approach. The U.S. military, following international law, treated prisoners with dignity and offered access to reading material, letters, and even leisure activities, elements that challenged the deeply ingrained perceptions of military hierarchy and gender behavior these women had internalized. Daily life in these camps was structured, but not oppressive. Meals were standardized, medical care was provided, and educational materials, ranging from novels and magazines to photographs of life beyond the war, were made available. Some camps encouraged prisoners to read, write, and engage in organized recreational activities. For women raised in the Axis system, this freedom to choose one's reading or engage in leisure without scrutiny was extraordinary. Letters and post-war testimonies reveal the shock these women felt upon discovering the discrepancy between what they had been taught and the reality in Allied camps. German female officers wrote of the disbelief when shown newsreels of Allied victories, of being introduced to Hollywood stars, or witnessing women pilots in flight suits. Japanese women recounted astonishment at being allowed to read, write, and even joke with their captors. In each case, the Allies' approach was deliberate, treating prisoners humanely, providing intellectual and cultural stimulation, and demonstrating a level of trust that Axis indoctrination had deemed impossible. This backdrop of shifting power, ideological confrontation, and unexpected humane treatment set the stage for moments of profound psychological dissonance. Female prisoners, steeped in the rigid hierarchies and cultural norms of their homelands, were encountering an environment that challenged every assumption they had been taught about loyalty, morality, and gender roles. It was within this context, harsh winter days, rigid routines, and the unyielding pressures of a losing war, that these women first came face to face with books, photographs, and experiences that would unsettle their worldview and plant the seeds for both curiosity and reflection. While the strategic and military context set the stage, the cultural and social dimensions shaped the daily experience of female POWs. In Germany and Japan, women were socialized into highly regimented roles. German women in the Kriegsmarine, Luftwaffe, and auxiliary corps were trained to maintain discipline, follow orders, and uphold the ideals of the Reich. Their education emphasized obedience, moral purity, and the importance of loyalty to the fatherland. Similarly, Japanese women serving in support roles were steeped in the principles of Bushido, honor, duty, and sacrifice, applied within a rigidly hierarchical society. When these women were captured, the cultural shock was immediate. Allied camps operated on fundamentally different assumptions about human behavior and gender. Officers recognized that humane treatment, providing food, medical care, recreational materials, and intellectual stimulation, was not only a legal obligation under the Geneva Convention, but also a psychological tool that encouraged compliance without cruelty. Books, newspapers, and photographs were standard elements of camp life. Yet for Axis women, the idea of being trusted with personal choice, access to foreign media, or even casual conversation with captors was alien. The introduction of media played a particularly striking role. German and Japanese prisoners, accustomed to tightly controlled propaganda, encountered images of women in leadership roles, Hollywood stars, and Allied women pilots. In Germany, female POWs were sometimes shown newsreels depicting Allied victories, civilian life abroad, and women participating in aviation and industry, scenes utterly at odds with their indoctrinated understanding of gender and power. Japanese prisoners were similarly exposed to films, magazines, and photographs portraying life in the United States and Allied nations, including moments of humor, leisure, and intellectual engagement, activities that had been deliberately suppressed in their upbringing. Daily routines in the camps further emphasized this contrast. Allied officers encouraged structured activity but allowed personal choice. Women could choose books from small libraries, engage in conversation, or participate in recreational exercises. They were not punished for curiosity or dissenting opinions. On the contrary, intellectual engagement was subtly encouraged. Reports and post-war testimonies highlight that many German and Japanese female prisoners initially struggled to navigate this freedom. Some feared retribution or considered it improper to express interest in entertainment or literature. Yet, gradually, they began to explore the materials provided, their initial shock giving way to curiosity and reflection. These differences in treatment were intentional and strategic. Allied officers understood that morale and behavior could be influenced without resorting to harsh punishment. By respecting the dignity and intelligence of prisoners, the Allies created an environment that reduced resistance and encouraged cooperation. Female POWs, observing these differences firsthand, experienced cognitive dissonance. The world they had been taught existed, harsh, unforgiving, and morally rigid, clashed with the reality of humane, permissive, and intellectually stimulating treatment. The cultural gap was heightened by the very human interactions between captors and prisoners. Laughter, conversation, and informal gestures of kindness were common in U.S. camps. Japanese women, in particular, were astonished to find captors who smiled, joked, or even listened to their concerns. German officers, trained to project authority and maintain strict hierarchies, often found themselves perplexed by the relaxed but orderly structure of the camps. The combination of structured freedom, exposure to media, and respectful interpersonal conduct created an environment radically different from anything these women had known. At the same time, the global military context continued to influence these experiences. The Allies were advancing on multiple fronts, and the morale of prisoners could not be separated from the wider narrative of a losing war. Reports from camp administrators indicate that German and Japanese women would often watch newsreels repeatedly, absorbing not only the facts of military defeat, but also glimpses of societal life in Allied nations. These moments, framed by the daily rhythm of camp life, meals, roll calls, and chores, heightened the emotional and intellectual impact of the cultural exposure. By the end of their initial weeks in captivity, many female POWs were already beginning to reconcile two conflicting realities: the rigid hierarchical world of their upbringing and the surprisingly humane, trust-based environment of the Allied camps. These early experiences laid the groundwork for the more profound emotional and psychological moments to come, where curiosity, humor, and disbelief would transform into reflection and, in some cases, lasting personal change. Human angle. The human dimension of female POW experiences reveals the profound psychological dissonance they faced. Women raised in Axis societies, conditioned to obey, distrust the enemy, and view their own society as morally superior, found themselves in a world that defied every expectation. The simple act of being offered a book of their choice was revolutionary. German officers, taught to maintain authority through intimidation, and Japanese auxiliaries, socialized to defer entirely to military hierarchy, were suddenly entrusted with personal agency. The initial reactions were a mixture of disbelief, hesitation, and curiosity. Some clutched the books as if they were forbidden objects. Others hesitated to open them, fearing reprisal or considering it morally inappropriate. Over time, these materials became gateways to self-reflection, a rare space where they could engage with ideas, stories, and perspectives unfiltered by propaganda. Laughter and curiosity, once foreign, began to surface, subtly reshaping their daily emotional landscape. Leadership angle. Allied officers, both American and British, approached female POWs with a strategic yet humane philosophy. Camp commanders understood that humane treatment was not merely ethical, but operationally effective. By providing access to reading materials, photographs, and recreational activities, they reduced tension, promoted compliance, and maintained order. Leaders like Colonel Wilhelm H. Smith of the U.S. Army emphasized structured freedom. Prisoners had routines, yet they were empowered to choose their intellectual and recreational engagements. The contrast with Axis leadership training could not have been starker. Where German and Japanese women had been taught rigid obedience and unquestioning authority, Allied leadership models demonstrated that trust, respect, and dignity could coexist with discipline. This not only facilitated smoother camp operations, but also had a subtle psychological effect, teaching prisoners that authority need not be feared to be effective. Technological/media angle. Media and technology played a critical role in shaping these POW experiences. Allied camps employed newsreels, magazines, and photographs as both educational and psychological tools. Images of women pilots in flight suits, factory workers, and Hollywood stars challenged the narrow gender constructs instilled in Axis societies. Newsreels documenting Allied victories served dual purposes, informing prisoners of the strategic reality while exposing them to broader cultural contexts. For many Japanese women, the first sight of smiling, laughing Americans or women performing professional roles was a revelation. Similarly, German officers were struck by the professionalism, confidence, and independence of women in Allied societies, a stark contrast to their indoctrination. These technologies, seemingly simple tools of information, became catalysts for cognitive dissonance, forcing prisoners to reconcile the world they had been taught existed with the world they now observed. Enemy perspective. From the Axis viewpoint, these experiences were almost incomprehensible. German and Japanese military doctrines had instilled in female officers and auxiliaries a strict sense of loyalty, subordination, and ideological conformity. Propaganda portrayed the Allies as morally corrupt, decadent, and incapable of disciplined governance. When female POWs were exposed to humane treatment, access to literature, and informal interactions with captors, it directly contradicted these lessons. Letters and post-war testimonies reveal the shock. Japanese women described being stunned when Americans laughed with them or treated them as rational adults rather than mere subordinates. German officers reported confusion when allowed to choose books freely or when exposed to Allied women in professional and military roles. The stark contrast between expectation and reality created cognitive friction, undermining decades of indoctrination and fostering a slow, sometimes reluctant, reassessment of enemy narratives. Tactical/moral angle. The Allied approach to female POWs was not simply ethical, it was tactical. By demonstrating respect, trust, and fairness, camp commanders reduced the likelihood of unrest and fostered cooperation. For prisoners accustomed to authoritarian discipline and fear-based compliance, this method created a subtle moral tension. They were forced to reconcile their beliefs. If the enemy could be humane, could their own leadership be flawed? This moral awakening, often triggered by seemingly small acts such as lending books or showing photographs, became a tool of psychological management. The Allies' moral strategy leveraged humane behavior to maintain control, demonstrating that ethical treatment and operational efficiency were not mutually exclusive. Psychological angle. The long-term psychological impact on female POWs was profound. Exposure to new ideas, cultural norms, and humanized authority challenged their internalized worldviews. For German women, witnessing Allied women pilots or civilians in leadership positions planted seeds of doubt about traditional gender roles. Japanese prisoners, steeped in the ideals of Bushido and sacrifice, struggled with feelings of guilt, gratitude, and confusion when treated with respect. Psychologists studying post-war accounts noted that these experiences often left women with a lasting impression of the humanity of the enemy, challenging entrenched notions of ideological purity. The dissonance between indoctrination and observed reality forced cognitive flexibility, which would influence their post-war reintegration and perceptions of Allied nations. Cultural angle. The cultural exposure inherent in these interactions extended beyond individual psychology. Books, magazines, photographs, and newsreels introduced female POWs to lifestyles, freedoms, and gender roles radically different from their own. Hollywood stars, female aviators, and everyday civilian life in the Allied nations provided visual proof of alternative social structures. For women whose entire worldview had been curated by propaganda and military training, these glimpses were transformative. Many initially reacted with disbelief or skepticism. Over time, however, repeated exposure normalized these images, demonstrating that life outside Axis control was both vibrant and morally complex. This cultural shock not only expanded prisoners' understanding of gender and society, but also contributed to the subtle erosion of totalitarian indoctrination. Summary. Through human, leadership, technological, enemy, moral, psychological, and cultural angles, the experiences of female POWs emerge as a multidimensional story of shock, curiosity, and transformation. Each perspective highlights how the simple act of humane treatment, books, photographs, laughter, and freedom could ripple across ideology, psychology, and culture, reshaping perceptions long before liberation arrived. These angles naturally lead us to the climax, the decisive moments when the prisoner's initial shock gave way to tangible change in behavior, attitude, and worldview. Spring 1945. The war was nearing its conclusion, and the Allies were consolidating their hold on territory across Europe and the Pacific. In a quiet barracks in a U.S.-administered camp, German and Japanese female prisoners gathered, tense but curious. Crates of books and photographs had arrived once again, and the officers instructed the women to choose freely. For many, this was their first taste of unmediated choice since captivity began. Some hesitated, hands hovering over the spines of novels, while others peered at photographs of smiling actresses or women in flight suits. The initial disbelief was almost tangible. Accounts from post-war interviews reveal the mix of astonishment and tentative amusement. German officer Ingrid H., captured in the Rhineland, recalled her first encounter with a newsreel showing female Allied pilots executing training maneuvers. "We cannot believe our eyes," she said. "Women flying? And in uniform? It was something our instructors would have considered impossible. We were stunned, almost paralyzed with curiosity and fear of shame." Similarly, Japanese prisoner Yoko M., interned on Saipan before being transferred to a U.S. camp in the Philippines, described how she laughed in disbelief when shown photographs of American women cooking, playing sports, and interacting with their captors. "We had been taught that laughter with the enemy was dishonorable. Yet here it was allowed. We could not comprehend it." These small, seemingly mundane interactions, reading a book, viewing a photograph, watching a newsreel, marked the first critical turning point in the prisoner's psychological journey. The women began to realize that their assumptions about the enemy were fundamentally flawed. The human kindness, trust, and cultural openness of the Allies created a space for questioning deeply ingrained beliefs. Some prisoners experimented with small acts of agency, choosing which books to read, discussing stories quietly with fellow prisoners, or even mimicking gestures of casual humor they observed from officers. Tension remained, however. Many prisoners wrestled with internalized notions of honor, obedience, and propriety. A German officer might read a novel about life in New York and feel a surge of fascination, immediately countered by shame for enjoying something un-German. A Japanese auxiliary might laugh at a photograph of American women at leisure, only to experience guilt for indulging in humor alongside captors. The clash of emotion, ideology, and observation created an almost electric intensity within the barracks, as these women confronted cognitive dissonance on a daily basis. The Allies, aware of the psychological importance of these moments, allowed them to unfold naturally. Officers rarely interfered, understanding that the shock itself, witnessing a world so different from what they had been taught, was a transformative force. At the same time, they ensured that the environment remained safe and structured. There were no punitive measures for curiosity, laughter, or discussion. This trust, in itself, became revolutionary for prisoners steeped in rigid hierarchies. One particularly striking event occurred in a European camp when a German female officer watched a newsreel showing Allied forces liberating a concentration camp. The visual evidence of both Allied discipline and humanity struck her deeply. She realized that the war's narrative she had been taught, depicting the Allies as brutal, immoral, and deceitful, was false. The experience did not immediately erase indoctrination, but began a profound internal reckoning. Prisoners compared the orderliness, professionalism, and civility of their captors with their indoctrinated expectations, recognizing discrepancies that could no longer be ignored. For Japanese women, the pivotal moments often involved simple acts of shared humanity. A young nurse, accustomed to strict hierarchy and silence, was offered a choice of reading materials and invited to discuss them with an American officer. Initially hesitant, she gradually engaged in conversation, laughing at shared observations in ways previously forbidden. These small interactions, the allowance of personal agency, intellectual curiosity, and social engagement, constituted the first real cracks in the psychological walls erected by years of militarized indoctrination. By the end of the first spring months in captivity, the prisoner's transformation was unmistakable. Disbelief and hesitation were gradually replaced with cautious curiosity. The women began to read books, discuss photographs, and engage with newsreels not as forbidden objects, but as sources of insight. Their worldview was shifting, subtle yet irreversible. The Allies were not the monstrous, morally corrupt enemies depicted in propaganda, and the rigid assumptions about women's roles in society and warfare were being challenged by direct observation. This first phase of the climax set the stage for deeper transformation. Initial shock had become engagement. Confusion had given way to reflection, and the prisoners were on the brink of confronting the larger psychological and cultural implications of their captivity. The next stage would reveal the full impact of these experiences on behavior, belief, and identity. By late spring 1945, the experiences that had begun with hesitant curiosity had evolved into profound psychological and emotional shifts among female POWs. What started as disbelief, books, photographs, newsreels, transformed into active engagement and reflection. Prisoners were now exploring the boundaries of their agency within the camp. German and Japanese women no longer merely observed the humanized treatment of their captors. They began to internalize it, reconciling it with their own assumptions about authority, loyalty, and morality. In the European camps, German female officers began reading novels that depicted daily life in Allied countries. Some read accounts of women in professional and military roles, while others chose literature that explored philosophical or moral dilemmas. The act of reading itself became transformative. Letters from former prisoners describe a growing sense of empowerment and curiosity. One officer, writing after the war, recalled, "The first time I read a book that wasn't dictated to me by instructors or propaganda, I felt a freedom I had never known and a shock at how narrow my previous life had been." Similarly, Japanese prisoners documented their astonishment at being allowed to read novels, discuss ideas, and even joke with officers, experiences that challenged the rigid hierarchy and social codes ingrained in them. The visual exposure to Allied culture further deepened the transformation. Newsreels showing women pilots, factory workers, and civilians living independently undermined the indoctrinated belief that female capability was inherently limited to domestic or supportive roles. For many, the cognitive dissonance was acute. The world they had been taught existed did not align with what they were witnessing. Yet instead of provoking fear or defiance, these encounters sparked engagement. Prisoners began discussing, questioning, and reflecting, marking a profound shift in attitude. Humor became another transformative element. Laughter, previously forbidden when shared with the enemy, emerged spontaneously during activities, storytelling, or when observing photographs of life outside the camps. Japanese women, initially startled by the relaxed social interactions of American officers, gradually joined in light-hearted exchanges. German officers noted a similar phenomenon. Moments of shared amusement, subtle and controlled, created an atmosphere of human connection that contrasted sharply with the fear and discipline of their prior environment. These small, humanizing interactions played a critical role in eroding entrenched assumptions and fostering adaptive thinking. The psychological turning point also manifested in behavior. Women began choosing their reading materials with intention, engaging in discussions about cultural and moral differences, and questioning previously unquestioned norms. In some cases, prisoners who had been rigid in their adherence to ideology demonstrated flexibility and critical thinking. The camp environment, designed to provide both structure and freedom, enabled this shift. Officers observed that the prisoners' willingness to engage voluntarily reflected not only trust in the Allies, but also an internal reassessment of authority, morality, and gender roles. Cultural shock extended beyond individual psychology into collective identity. Witnessing women pilots in flight suits, for instance, forced German officers to reconsider the societal limitations placed upon women. Similarly, Japanese prisoners, seeing Allied women laugh, learn, and exercise autonomy, recognized that the rigid social codes they had internalized were not universal. The realization that alternative models of behavior in society existed had a destabilizing but ultimately enlightening effect. For many, this exposure planted the seeds of lifelong reflection on gender, authority, and the nature of power. The culmination of this stage was the prisoners' acceptance, tentative but unmistakable, that their world had changed. The initial astonishment at freedom of choice, exposure to media, and humanized treatment had matured into engagement, understanding, and curiosity. Captivity, which might have been purely traumatic, became an arena for intellectual and emotional growth. German and Japanese women began to see their captors not simply as enemies, but as humans, capable of both authority and kindness, of order and humor. By the end of this turning point, the prisoners' internal worlds had shifted dramatically. Indoctrination, rigid hierarchies, and ingrained propaganda had not vanished, but they were now subject to scrutiny and reflection. The seeds of doubt, curiosity, and moral reassessment were firmly planted. This evolution set the stage for the aftermath, where the consequences of these experiences, on the prisoners, the camps, and post-war memory, would be fully realized. With the collapse of Axis resistance in Europe and the Pacific, the final months of the war brought liberation and reflection for female POWs. By mid-1945, Allied forces were managing an unprecedented number of prisoners, including thousands of women from Germany and Japan. The experiences forged within the camps, books, newsreels, photographs, and daily humane treatment, left an indelible mark on those who had survived captivity. Unlike male prisoners who often faced direct combat trauma, female POWs' defining experiences were cultural and psychological. The challenge of reconciling indoctrination with observed reality and the exposure to ideas and behaviors previously deemed impossible. Official reports from U.S. Army camps indicate that German and Japanese female prisoners displayed high levels of compliance and cooperation. Commanders attributed this to a combination of structured routine and humane treatment. Providing access to reading materials and newsreels was not merely benevolent. It was an effective management strategy. Camp administrators noted that prisoners engaged willingly in daily tasks, demonstrated intellectual curiosity, and, in some cases, began questioning previously held ideological positions. Letters sent post-war by former prisoners corroborate these observations. One German officer wrote, "The books and photographs did more than entertain us. They made us think. For the first time, we could see a world beyond our training and propaganda." For Japanese women, similar patterns emerged. Prisoners recounted being shocked by Americans' relaxed, humanized interactions, including the allowance to laugh, converse, and make personal choices. These experiences contrasted sharply with the strict hierarchy and disciplinary rigor of Japanese military culture. The contrast was so profound that many women described feeling both guilt and relief. Guilt for enjoying the small freedoms and relief that humane behavior was possible even in the midst of war. Post-war accounts emphasize that these impressions were enduring, influencing perceptions of authority, morality, and cultural difference long after repatriation. The liberation process further magnified the impact of these experiences. In Europe, German women were repatriated gradually, often passing through debriefing centers where Allied officers recorded testimonies. Many highlighted the role of books, newsreels, and photographs in expanding their understanding of the wider world. Similarly, Japanese female POWs underwent interviews and processing in the Pacific Theater. Both groups emphasized the psychological effect of observing Allied women in active, professional, or military roles. These accounts were collected not only for historical documentation, but also to evaluate the effectiveness of humane treatment in managing POW populations. Statistical reports provide additional context. In U.S.-administered European camps, female prisoners numbered in the low thousands, but their experiences reflected broader trends in Allied policy. Camps consistently reported minimal incidents of unrest or non-compliance among women, a stark contrast to male counterparts in some facilities. Officers attributed this to a combination of structured freedom, intellectual engagement, and respectful interpersonal treatment. In the Pacific, although Japanese female POWs were fewer, the psychological impact of Allied policies was even more pronounced due to the stark cultural contrast between Japanese societal norms and American practices. The combination of observation, cultural exposure, and humanized treatment initiated a subtle but profound shift in worldview. By the time the prisoners were liberated, they had not only endured captivity, but had been exposed to models of behavior, authority, and gender roles radically different from their indoctrinated expectations. This foundation would inform the next stage, the broader aftermath, including personal reflections, post-war integration, and the long-term impact on memory, ideology, and cultural understanding.